Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Diana Negroponte. Diana is a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and also the Cold War International History Project. But more importantly, today she joins us in her capacity as an author. Her new book has been published. It's called Master Negotiator: The Role of James A. Baker III at the End of the Cold War. An epic work, Diana. Congratulations on reaching the finish line. Always exciting. So before we delve into the story that the book tells, I want to give our viewers a peek behind the curtain, the story of the making of. Tell us about your original concept about 5 years ago and how the book evolved.
I had completed a book about Central Americas at the end of the Cold War. It was how peace came to Central America. And once you start delving into that period of the late 1980s, you become intrigued by what happened in other parts of the world. How was it possible that Germany united? How is it possible that the Israelis and the Palestinians on the West Bank could sit down together? So my curiosity led me to a man. It led me to a Secretary of State who made it possible when it was not apparently possible.
So you did not set out to write a book about James Baker, but that's where the trail led.
That's right.
You know, and you mentioned this moment in history as I was going through the book. Even though I lived through it, you forget all of the epic things that happened internationally during that period. It's really awesome. As far as historical significance, the number of events that changed the world.
Yes, and the principal cause of it was Mikhail Gorbachev's determination to change or revolutionize the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev's efforts could have been met by a rambunctious president in Washington, determined to cry victory and stand on the wall, and instead the careful, methodical examination of what was happening to ensure that the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War took place peacefully. That's the great success.
And how much of that, I know it's hard to separate. You describe George Herbert Walker Bush and James Baker as virtually brothers. How can we divide who gets the credit for that thoughtful, methodical approach, and how much of it was just the alchemy between these two men?
The alchemy is very important. Remember that George H.W. Bush had been immersed in foreign policy. He'd been our representatives to the People's Republic of China. He'd been our representative at the United Nations. He'd been the head of the CIA. This man knew international relations, and his Rolodex of world leaders was formidable. But his brother-in-arms, this closeness, was with a man who had great intelligence and with a foresight to see the problems, analyze problems, and pursue solutions with a determination which is remarkable.
There are many smart people, but not all of them rise to the level where they can be called master negotiators. What were the qualities that James Baker had that made him the man for that moment?
He, besides great intelligence and a mastery of his brief, he had the capacity to understand the other person with whom he was negotiating. And he could see from the other person's perspective, be it Gorbachev, be it the Israeli leaders, be it the Iraqi leaders, what they needed if they were to emerge from that meeting and be able to sell it to their followers. So it's not empathy, but it is the ability to understand from where the other side is coming. Those are skills which lawyers develop and Baker was a lawyer.
So you think it was part of his training, and how much of it was also intuitive? Was it part of just who he was as a person?
Maybe. I don't know the answer to that.
Hard to, yeah. And I guess we wouldn't know it from ourselves, let alone for somebody else. You focus on 7 critical questions, and I want to run through some of those with you because it's again a fascinating overview of that amazing period of history. You talk about this policy review that was initiated by Brent Scowcroft at the beginning of the administration. What is the significance of that?
President George H.W. Bush, having been vice president for 8 years, was determined not to be seen as the third Reagan administration. So newness had to enter into it. But who do you turn for newness? So Baker turned to his own institution, the Department of State, and asked those who were situated there, who were the assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, etc., develop alternatives. But for men and women who had been steeped in the policy of the second Reagan administration and many of the first administration of President Reagan, the development of new ideas was very difficult, if not impossible. Mm-hmm. So while the public message is we are reviewing, the actuality was that we were stuck. The State Department could not come up with new ideas. And meantime, both Secretary General Gorbachev in Moscow and the leaders in Paris, Bonn, Rome, and London were saying, hey guys, haven't you finished your review? Isn't it about time? And therefore, an effort had to be made to break out of this circle. And I believe that that effort came from Scowcroft and from Baker's insistence that something new had to happen.
You already mentioned one of the other touchstones of your 7 critical questions, which was the unification of Germany. What were the key moments there and the key strategic decisions taken that led to a positive outcome?
The key moments start really at the beginning in 1989, where Chancellor Helmut Kohl of Germany seeks to unite the East with the West. But everybody has turned around and said, impossible, particularly the Europeans who fear the return of a powerful Germany in the center of Europe. So when Washington and George H.W. Bush with Baker decide that they will support Kohl, this is a moment which is unprecedented. Not only are they going to support the unification, they're going to persuade Paris, London, Rome, Madrid, that it's in their interest to take place. It's also in the interest of those other countries that Germany should be anchored in NATO. And that proposal was abhorrent to Moscow. Moscow could not accept that East Germany, the industrial crown of the Soviet Union, would move from the Warsaw Pact and become part of NATO. So the struggle to achieve that required not only skillful thinking and strategic planning, but it required sheer persistence to persuade Gorbachev that the Soviets would be safer with a united Germany in NATO, and to persuade Chancellor Kohl that he should be ready to open up his pocketbook and provide coal, potatoes, and money for the Soviet people.
Mm-hmm. Great people, great men, great women are not necessarily saints. They have flaws. And you talk about an instance in reaction to policy toward China following the Tiananmen Square massacre, where Mr. Baker decided to take a lower profile and distance himself a bit from that policy reaction. Could you talk a bit about that and what that tells us about the man?
You may recall that in June of 1989, students and workers had occupied Tiananmen Square, the center of Beijing, for the last several weeks. And they were there in support of a reformist leader in the Communist Party. But their presence was bound to cause conflict and oppression from the leadership in China. Baker had been warned that this was happening. Ambassador Lilly had warned the State Department, watch out. The administration is not going to tolerate the presence of thousands of students and workers in the sacred square in front of the forbidden city. So when it happened, it was a surprise. But in Washington, the president, who had served 10 months in Beijing, was ready to be the China desk. In other words, the lead on China. Since he knew the leadership there, he felt that he could pick up the telephone and call them and say, hey, buddies, stop it. They didn't answer his telephone calls. And so Baker was able to say, look, the boss is leading on China. I do not understand or know the details of China. Therefore, I'm going to leave it to others. And I think that that is a moment of doubt. We may understand that he was focused on Moscow, he was focused on the Europeans, but China was a big deal, and he was absent.
I remember at the time when Saddam's forces were driven from Kuwait by this grand coalition, this new world order that President Bush and James Baker constructed, that there was a question about should they have continued on to Baghdad or leave the regime in place, and that's the decision they made, the latter. Could you talk about James Baker's role in that calculation?
Baker was determined to respect the terms under which he had persuaded the coalition partners to join the United States. We get them out of Kuwait. There was no agreement on getting Saddam out of Baghdad. So Baker was going to keep to his side of the agreement. They get out of Kuwait. The question that is more of greater concern is, why did Baker not focus when Saddam was defeated and his army dispersed? Why did he not focus on strengthening the Gulf nations to create a regional security agreement that could repel any future Saddam adventure, which you and I know took place in 2003, but which, if there had been a stronger Gulf cooperation security agreement, need not have happened.
There are ties that bind. There is a tie that binds the next two critical questions you identify. And the first is about the Baltics, Yugoslavia, and Ukraine. And then the next is about the aftermath of the failed coup attempt in the Soviet Union against Mikhail Gorbachev, and then the emergence of Boris Yeltsin. And in both of those stories, a theme that emerges is a preference for stability and I'm wondering, again, that alchemy, was this a Baker initiative, a Bush initiative, or is this a place where they both were in lockstep?
They're in lockstep. Clearly, there was no desire to be adventurous or highly risk-taking in the United States. These are professional leaders of nations who do not take dangerous risks. Therefore, stability could ensure the preeminence of the United States without risking war or a major conflagration on the European continent. And that's why you see Baker going out of his way to keep Gorbachev content anyway in the presidency of the Soviet Union, even though Baker knows power has slipped to Boris Yeltsin. And Baker will make every effort to ensure that both Gorbachev and Yeltsin know what American policy is, allow them to anticipate the next steps, and ensure stability. But the biggest issue of stability is to ensure that the thousands of nuclear arms and weapons and installations after the collapse pass to a safeguarded place. And Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar found in Baker eventually a major ally in persuading the presidents of those newly independent states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, to transfer their weapons and their nuclear material to Moscow, to Russia. That was an extraordinary feat.
So by that measure, you would have to judge their bias towards stability as a successful calculation.
Yes.
And then the seventh question you identify is perhaps the one that would define the era for both the president he served and James Baker, is did the US do enough after the fall of the Soviet Union? Did it make the right moves?
I'm disappointed in Baker on this one, because having persuaded Congress to take actions on Iraq and on Germany they might not necessarily wanted to have done, he failed to try to persuade Congress to put up the money necessary to support a gradual dissolution of the Soviet Union. The men and women in the Soviet Union went hungry and cold that winter of 1991 and 91-92. The humiliation and the poverty led them to look for a man who could restore their pride and status in the world, and they found it in Vladimir Putin. Had Baker put the same effort and persistence into collecting the funds necessary, I think we could have avoided Putin emerging as Russia's leader.
Which is one great reason to second guess, right? Well, thank you for that concise and insightful linear voyage through those years. Now I want to ask you a couple other questions in a nonlinear fashion. One phrase that jumped out to me as I think of the current circumstance for President-elect Joe Biden is that you said the first strategic decision taken by James Baker was to strengthen relations with European allies. Sounds like the past might be prelude to what might happen now.
Yes, John. Baker and George H.W. Bush's success in foreign policy was due to the fact that they worked with allies, not in competition with them, but in a sharing and convergence of goals. That succeeded and enabled the Cold War to end peacefully. The President-elect Biden is determined to do the same.
So I know this is a bit of a gimmicky question, but I'm interested in your opinion on your opinion on Mr. Baker. Greatest achievement, greatest failure.
I think that the greatest achievement is to have maintained that consistent policy over 4 years, despite the variety and complexity of problems facing the United States at that time. So his steadiness and persistence is what I admire most. Weaknesses, he may have liked to have been president. He didn't get a chance.
Well, he had quite a resume, and he's still involved in the discussion, even though he never achieved that level of office. Speaking of him, your interviews with him for this book, was he very forthcoming? Is he someone who tends to be introspective about reviewing his past? How did you find those discussions?
He is a man of great courtesy and a very dignified gentleman. He was not about to give me inside scoops. I had to get those from others. So there was great decorum but not much imagination on his side. And that's principally because he didn't know me. And therefore, who is this woman coming to ask him impertinent questions, including questions about, can you tell me some of your dirty jokes? Which, of course, he wouldn't do.
Because of being a fine Southern gentleman, right? It just wouldn't be in his DNA. So final thought, Diana, is I'm always curious when someone undertakes a massive research project that evolves over time organically and culminates in this terrific book, is what changed for you about the story from when you entered, knowing what you knew, having lived through the period, and where you ended up? Were there things that emerged for you that changed your perceptions of either people or events or both?
I had not realized the quantity of difficult problems that a Secretary of State must engage with when he takes, or she takes, the helm of that agency. Baker entered, and I entered into this process thinking, I'll focus on Germany, I'll focus on Iraq, maybe there's one or two other. And I found a multitude of complex issues which could not be resolved among lower level officials, but required that decision-making by a Secretary of State with his president to resolve the issue. I hadn't expected that.
Will he end up on the short list, or is he already on the short list of greatest secretaries of states ever?
Dean Acheson is going to be hard to break, but I think he's up there.
Great. Thank you, Diana, for this discussion. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, Master Negotiator, the role of James A. Baker III at the end of the Cold War, available now. And you know, it's the holiday season. It's a great time to give books as gifts, and this would be a terrific book to share. Thanks again, Diana. Thanks to our viewers. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.